He thought he'd heard everything a barn could hold, but the sound coming from behind the hay bales wasn't a wounded animal. It was a child, no more than 2 years old, with tears streaming down dirt-stained cheeks and a crumpled note clutched in tiny fingers. Caleb Whitmore stood frozen in the doorway of his barn, the morning light casting long shadows across weathered wooden planks. For 15 years, he'd walked this same path every dawn to tend his cattle, and never once had he found anything more surprising than a stray cat or a snake seeking shelter. But there she was, a little girl with tangled brown hair, wearing a torn dress that had seen better days, sitting among the loose hay like she'd been waiting for him. The child's cries echoed through the empty space, a sound that cut through Caleb's chest like a blade. At 45, he'd given up hope of ever hearing children's voices in his home. He and Martha had tried for years, visited every doctor within 100 miles, prayed until their knees bled. But the good Lord had other plans. Their house remained silent, their cradle empty, their hearts slowly hardening against the dream that refused to come true. But here was a child, real, and breathing, and desperate. Caleb took a careful step forward, his boots crunching on scattered straw. The little girl looked up at him with eyes the color of summer sky, wide with fear and exhaustion. She didn't run, just watched him with the wariness of someone far too young to understand the world's cruelty, but old enough to sense danger. "Easy there, little one," Caleb whispered, crouching down to her level. His voice, roughened by years of calling cattle and barking orders to ranch hands, softened to something he barely recognized. "I'm not gonna hurt you," the child hiccuped, her small body shaking with each sob. That's when Caleb noticed the paper in her grasp, folded carefully, edges worn as if it had been handled many times. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized this wasn't some lost child who'd wandered onto his property. Someone had left her here. Someone had meant for him to find her. "Can you let me see that?" Caleb extended his hand slowly, the way he'd approach a spooked horse. The girl stared at him for a long moment, then loosened her grip. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with secrets and intentions he couldn't yet fathom. Martha's voice drifted from the house, calling his name for breakfast. In a few minutes she'd come looking for him, wondering why he was taking so long with the morning chores. How could he explain this? How could he tell his wife, who still set a place at their table for the child they'd never had, that God had dropped a miracle in their barn? Caleb unfolded the note with trembling fingers, his eyes scanning handwriting that looked familiar but couldn't place. The words hit him like a physical blow, each line rewriting everything he thought he knew about his life, his marriage, his past. But what the note revealed about the child's identity, and why she'd been left specifically for him, would test every belief he'd ever held about forgiveness, love, and the price of secrets buried too deep. Martha's scream pierced the morning air when she saw Caleb walking toward the house with the child in his arms. She dropped the coffee pot she'd been holding, the ceramic shattering against the porch steps as brown liquid spread across the weathered wood. "Caleb, what in God's name?" Her words died in her throat as she took in the little girl's tear-stained face, and the way Caleb held her, like she was made of spun glass and might disappear if he loosened his grip. "Found her in the barn," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. "Someone left her there. With this." He handed Martha the note, watching as his wife's face went pale while reading words that would change everything between them. The child had stopped crying but remained silent, pressing her face against Caleb's shoulder. Martha's hands shook as she folded the paper, her eyes darting between her husband and the little girl who'd appeared like an answer to prayers they'd stopped praying. "We need to take her to town," Martha whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "The sheriff, or the preacher, or no." The word came out harder than Caleb intended. He felt the child's tiny fingers grip his shirt tighter, as if she understood that her fate hung in the balance of this conversation. "Not yet. We need to think about this." Martha stepped closer, studying the little girl's face with an intensity that made Caleb's stomach twist. The child had his eyes, not just the color, but the shape, the way they crinkled slightly at the corners. Anyone who looked closely enough would see it. Martha was looking very closely. What does she say? About where she came from? Martha's voice was barely audible now, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile hope was building in her chest. She won't talk. Not a word since I found her. Caleb shifted the child's weight in his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile. But she's not afraid anymore. Not like she was. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the yard where three people stood at the crossroads of a decision that would define their future. Martha reached out tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. The little girl didn't pull away, just watched Martha with those impossibly blue eyes that seemed to hold secrets no 2-year-old should carry. She's beautiful, Martha breathed, and Caleb heard 15 years of longing packed into those 2 words. His wife had spent countless nights staring at empty rooms they'd prepared for children who never came, touching baby clothes that never held small bodies, humming lullabies to silence. But now there was a child in their arms, warm and real and needing them. The note, Caleb began, then stopped. How could he explain what those few lines had revealed without destroying his marriage? How could he tell Martha that this child represented both the answer to her prayers and the confirmation of his deepest betrayal? Martha's eyes narrowed as she studied his face. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read every expression, every hesitation, every lie he'd ever tried to tell. There's something you're not saying, something about what's written there. The child chose that moment to speak her first word, soft and clear and devastating in its simplicity. Papa. Martha's intake of breath was sharp enough to cut stone. Caleb felt the world tilt beneath his feet as the implications of that single word settled between them like a loaded gun. The little girl wasn't just any abandoned child. She knew him. She'd been taught to call him Papa. And if Martha connected the dates, the timing, the resemblance that was becoming impossible to ignore, she'd realize that this child's appearance wasn't just a miracle. It was proof of everything Caleb had hoped would stay buried forever. The word, Papa, hung in the air like smoke from a gun that couldn't be unfired. Martha took a step back, her face cycling through confusion, hurt, and a dawning realization that made Caleb's blood run cold. She knows you. It wasn't a question. Martha's voice carried the weight of a woman who'd just watched her world crack down the middle. This child knows you, Caleb. The little girl buried her face deeper into Caleb's neck, as if sensing the storm brewing around her. He could feel her small heart beating against his chest, rapid and frightened. Whatever innocence had brought her to their barn was being stripped away by the tension crackling between the adults who held her fate in their hands. Martha, let me explain. Don't. She held up a hand, stopping his words before they could form lies or truths he wasn't ready to speak. Not here. Not in front of her. Martha's eyes fixed on the child with an expression Caleb couldn't read. Part longing, part fury, part desperate hope. Take her inside. Feed her. Get her cleaned up. Caleb nodded, grateful for the reprieve, but Martha wasn't finished. Then you're going to tell me everything. Every detail about how a child who calls you Papa ended up abandoned in our barn with a note you can barely look at. Her voice cracked on the last words. 15 years of barrenness and broken dreams bleeding through her composure. Inside the house, Caleb set the child down in their kitchen, a room that had always felt too big, too empty, with chairs that never held small bodies and a table that had only ever seated 2. The little girl stood uncertainly, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of her torn dress as she took in her surroundings. Martha moved with mechanical precision, heating milk on the stove and cutting bread into small pieces. But Caleb caught the way her hands shook when she thought he wasn't watching, the way she paused to stare at the child when she thought no one would notice. What's your name, sweetheart? Martha knelt down to the child's level, her voice gentle despite the storm raging behind her eyes. The little girl looked at Caleb, then back at Martha, her blue eyes wide and uncertain. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Lily. Martha's sharp intake of breath told Caleb she'd caught the significance. They'd chosen that name once, years ago, for the daughter they'd never had. They'd whispered it to each other in the dark, planning a nursery that would never be filled, dreaming of a future that never came. Now a child named Lily stood in their kitchen, calling Caleb Papa, and Martha was putting pieces together that would destroy everything. Lily, Martha repeated, tasting the name like it might turn to ash in her mouth. That's a beautiful name. She glanced at Caleb with eyes that held questions he wasn't ready to answer. The child accepted the milk with both hands, drinking deeply as if she hadn't eaten in days. Watching her, Caleb felt something breaking open in his chest, a feeling he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. Love, pure, immediate, and terrifying in its intensity. But loving this child meant confronting the truth about how she'd come to exist, and that truth would either save his marriage or end it. As Lily finished her milk and reached for Martha's hand with trusting innocence, Caleb realized that the note in his pocket contained more than just an explanation. It contained a choice that would force him to decide between the woman he'd loved for 20 years and the daughter he'd never known existed. While Lily napped on the parlor sofa, wrapped in Martha's best quilt, the reckoning Caleb had dreaded for years finally came. Martha sat across from him at their kitchen table, the crumpled note spread between them like evidence in a trial that would determine the rest of their lives. 3 years ago, Martha said, her voice deadly quiet, when you went to Amarillo for that cattle auction that lasted 2 weeks instead of 1. Her fingers traced the words on the paper, each line a dagger through whatever trust remained between them. This is from her, isn't it? From Helen Bradshaw. Caleb's silence was answer enough. He watched his wife's face harden, saw 20 years of marriage crystallizing into this single moment of truth. The note contained Helen's flowing handwriting, words that made his chest tight with guilt, and something else he didn't want to name. She's dying, Martha continued, reading from the paper with clinical detachment. Says she can't care for the child anymore. Says Lily deserves to know her real father before it's too late. She looked up at Caleb with eyes that held no warmth. Her real father. Martha, don't say my name like that. Don't you dare. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against wooden floor. 3 years I've wondered why you came back from that trip different. Quieter. Guilty. Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. I thought you'd lost money gambling or made some foolish business deal. Never imagined you'd lost your damn mind over another woman. Caleb felt the words like physical blows. Each accusation was true, each hurt justified, but hearing them stripped his soul bare. It wasn't like that. She was alone. Her husband had died, and I was lonely? Martha's voice could have cut glass. In a marriage? You were lonely in our marriage? The truth sat between them like a loaded weapon. Yes, he'd been lonely. They both had been. Years of failed pregnancies, of doctors saying there was nothing wrong, of watching other families grow while theirs remained frozen in hope and heartbreak. The silence in their house had become deafening, the empty rooms like accusations they couldn't answer. But that didn't excuse what he'd done. She wrote to you, Martha said, returning to the note. Sent word when the child was born. You knew about Lily for 2 years and said nothing. Her voice broke on the last word, and Caleb saw tears she was fighting to hold back. From the parlor came the sound of Lily stirring, small whimpers that meant she was waking from her nap. Both adults froze, listening to their future awakening in the next room. The note says more, Martha whispered, scanning the paper again. Says Helen's got consumption. Says she'll be dead within the month. She looked at Caleb with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. Says if we don't take Lily, she'll have to give her to the orphanage in Fort Worth. The weight of that possibility crushed down on Caleb's shoulders. An orphanage. His daughter, because she was his daughter, he could no longer deny it, would grow up among strangers, unloved, unwanted. The thought made him physically ill. I know what you're thinking, Martha said, watching his face. You're thinking about keeping her, about raising another woman's child as our own. She paused, studying him with laser intensity. But there's something you haven't considered. What's that? Whether I can forgive you enough to love her. Martha's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Whether I can look at this beautiful little girl every day and not see the proof that my husband betrayed everything we promised each other. From the parlor, Lily's voice called out, uncertain and afraid. Papa? Mama? The word mama hit Martha like a slap. The child was already expecting her to fill that role, already reaching for the love Martha had spent years preparing to give to a baby who'd never come. If you were Martha, what would you do? Choose to love a child who represents your husband's ultimate betrayal, or protect your heart from being broken again by someone who might be taken away. Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Martha decided next would determine whether Lily found the family she desperately needed, or whether the sins of the past would destroy any chance they had at becoming whole. The sound of hoofbeats outside interrupted the moment that would define their future, and when Caleb looked through the window, his blood turned to ice. A rider was approaching, and he recognized the figure in the saddle as Sheriff Coleman, whose expression suggested this wasn't a social call. Sheriff Coleman dismounted with the heavy movements of a man carrying bad news. His weathered face was grim as he approached the porch, hat in hand, eyes scanning the property with the practiced gaze of someone who'd seen too much trouble in his 40 years of keeping peace. Caleb, Martha. He nodded to each of them, but his attention fixed on the parlor window where Lily's small silhouette was visible. Got a telegram from Fort Worth this morning about a missing child. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Martha went rigid, her fingers gripping the porch railing until her knuckles turned white. Through the window they could see Lily pressing her face against the glass, watching the stranger with curious eyes. Missing child? Caleb managed, his voice steadier than he felt. Coleman pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. Helen Bradshaw passed yesterday evening. Consumption like the doctor said it would be. He paused, studying Caleb's face for a reaction. Problem is, her little girl disappeared from the boarding house where Helen was staying. Landlady says the child was there when Helen died, gone by morning. Martha's sharp intake of breath was audible. Coleman's eyes shifted to her, then back to Caleb. Course a 2-year-old can't just walk away on her own. Someone took her. Question is who and why. Sheriff, Martha began, her voice carefully controlled. What does this have to do with us? Coleman's expression softened slightly. He'd known Martha and Caleb for 15 years, had watched their struggle with childlessness, had seen the way hope died a little more each year in Martha's eyes. Well, Mrs. Whitmore, seems Helen left some papers, letters. One of them had your husband's name in it. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. Caleb felt everything he'd built with Martha crumbling beneath the weight of truth he could no longer hide. I'll need to see those papers, Coleman continued, his tone gentle but firm. And I'll need to know if you folks have seen anything unusual. A child matching the description. Maybe someone passing through who seemed out of place. Lily chose that moment to open the parlor door, stepping onto the porch with the fearless curiosity of someone too young to understand danger. She looked up at Coleman with bright blue eyes, then moved to stand beside Caleb, her small hand reaching for his. Papa, she said clearly, the word carrying across the yard like a confession. Coleman's eyebrows rose slightly. His gaze moved from Lily to Caleb to Martha, and Caleb watched understanding dawn on the sheriff's weathered features. Years of investigating crimes had taught Coleman to read people, to see connections others missed. Well, Coleman said slowly, crouching down to Lily's level. Hello there, little miss. What's your name? Lily, she answered without hesitation, then pointed at Caleb. That's my papa. Her finger swung to Martha. That's my mama. The simplicity of her declaration hit all three adults like lightning. Coleman straightened, his expression unreadable. Interesting. See, the missing child's name is Lily Bradshaw. 2 years old, brown hair, blue eyes. He looked directly at Caleb. Sound familiar? Martha stepped forward, her decision crystallizing in the face of potential loss. Sheriff Coleman, I think we need to talk inside, away from little ears. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." Coleman nodded, but his eyes never left Caleb's face. "I think that's a wise idea, Mrs. Whitmore, because right now, I've got a dead woman, a missing child, and enough questions to keep me busy for a long time." As they moved toward the house, Lily tugged on Caleb's shirt. When he looked down, she whispered something that made his blood freeze. "Mama Helen said you'd keep me safe from the bad man." Coleman stopped walking. "What bad man, sweetheart?" But Lily had already disappeared into the house, leaving behind a question that suggested Helen Bradshaw's death, and her daughter's appearance might not be the simple story of a dying woman's last wish. Someone else was involved. Someone dangerous enough that Helen had felt the need to hide her daughter. And now that person knew exactly where to find Lily. Inside the house, Coleman spread Helen's letters across the kitchen table like a map of secrets. The documents painted a picture that made Caleb's stomach churn with dread and something deeper, a protective rage he'd never felt before. "Helen wrote 3 letters before she died," Coleman explained, his finger tracing across the papers. "One to you, Caleb, asking you to take the child. One to her sister in Kansas, explaining why Lily couldn't go there." He paused, studying the 3rd letter with a grim expression. "And one to a judge in Fort Worth, detailing why Lily's life might be in danger." Martha leaned forward, her earlier anger temporarily set aside by maternal instinct. "Danger from whom?" Coleman's jaw tightened. "Man named Vincent Carrera, wealthy rancher from down south. Seems he's been claiming Lily as his own flesh and blood, trying to get legal custody since Helen took sick." Caleb felt ice form in his veins. "That's impossible. Helen told me." "Helen told you what you needed to hear," Coleman interrupted. "But the truth is messier. Carrera's been Helen's benefactor for years. Paid her rent, bought her things, acted like Lily's father in public." He looked directly at Caleb. "Course he never knew Helen was writing to you. Never knew Lily called another man Papa." Through the parlor doorway they could see Lily playing with Martha's sewing buttons, arranging them in careful patterns while humming softly to herself. The sight of the child, so innocent and trusting, made the adult's conversation feel like a violation of something pure. "Why would Carrera want the child if she's not his?" Martha asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. Coleman's expression darkened. "Helen's letter to the judge spells it out. Carrera's got no heirs, no legitimate children. He's been grooming Lily to inherit his ranch, his money, his name." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Problem is, Carrera's got a particular reputation with young women. Helen was terrified of what might happen to Lily when she got older." The kitchen fell silent, except for Lily's soft humming and the tick of the wall clock marking seconds that felt like hours. Caleb understood now why Helen had risked everything to bring Lily to him. It wasn't just about dying wishes or paternal rights. It was about saving his daughter from a future too horrible to contemplate. "There's more," Coleman continued, pulling out a final document. "Carrera filed papers yesterday claiming Lily was kidnapped. He's offering a reward for her return, $500. Martha's sharp gasp echoed through the room. $500 was more money than most families saw in 5 years. That kind of reward would bring bounty hunters, desperate men who wouldn't care about Lily's safety or happiness, only about collecting their payment. "How long before he tracks her here?" Caleb asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Could be days, could be hours. Carrera's got resources, connections. When he finds out Helen wrote to you." Coleman's words trailed off, but the threat was clear. Lily's humming stopped. She appeared in the doorway, her blue eyes wide with an intuition that children sometimes possess about adult fears. "Papa? Are we playing hide and seek?" The innocence of her question broke something in Martha's chest. She knelt down, opening her arms to the little girl who had stumbled into their lives carrying secrets and dangers none of them had anticipated. "Come here, sweetheart," Martha whispered, and when Lily ran to her, Caleb saw his wife's face transform. Whatever anger she'd held toward him was being overwhelmed by something stronger. the fierce protectiveness of a mother for her child. "We can't let him take her," Martha said, looking up at Caleb with eyes that held no compromise. "Whatever we have to do, wherever we have to go, we can't let that man have our daughter. Our daughter." The words hit Caleb like absolution and condemnation all at once. Martha had made her choice, had chosen love over hurt, had chosen to protect Lily despite the pain it might cost her. Coleman stood, gathering the letters with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd delivered bad news too many times. "I can give you maybe a day before Carrera's men start asking questions in town. After that," he shrugged, but his meaning was clear. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" Caleb asked, though he already knew. "I'm saying you folks might want to consider taking a trip. Maybe visit some relatives up north. Stay gone until this whole thing settles down." But even as Coleman spoke, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the windows. Too many horses, moving too fast, with the purposeful rhythm of men who knew exactly where they were going. Carrera hadn't waited. He'd come for his prize, and he'd brought enough firepower to ensure he got what he wanted. The game of hide-and-seek Lily had innocently mentioned was about to become deadly serious. 6 riders emerged from the dust cloud, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces hard with purpose. At their head rode a man whose expensive clothes and silver-trimmed saddle marked him as someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Vincent Carrera sat his horse like a king surveying conquered territory, his cold eyes scanning the farmhouse with predatory calculation. "Sheriff Coleman," Carrera called out, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and influence. "I trust you received my telegram about the stolen child." Coleman stepped onto the porch, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Mr. Carrera, didn't expect you to ride all this way personally. When something precious is taken from me, I handle the recovery myself." Carrera's gaze shifted to the house, where shadows moved behind curtained windows. "I have reason to believe the Bradshaw child is here." Inside, Caleb pressed his back against the wall beside the window, his heart hammering as he watched the scene unfold. Martha held Lily close, one hand covering the child's mouth to keep her quiet, though Lily seemed to sense the danger and remained perfectly still. "That's a serious accusation," Coleman replied, his tone neutral but his body language tense. "You got proof?" Carrera smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Helen Bradshaw wrote letters before she died. One of them mentioned this place, these people." He gestured toward the house with casual malice. "The child belongs with me. I've raised her, provided for her, given her a name. From what I understand," Coleman said carefully, "the child's got a father already. Blood father." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Carrera's pleasant mask slipped, revealing something cold and dangerous underneath. "The child is mine by right of care and provision. Whatever indiscretions Helen may have engaged in don't change that fact." One of Carrera's men shifted in his saddle, hand moving toward his weapon. Coleman noticed the movement, and his own stance subtly changed, ready for violence that felt inevitable. "Here's how this is going to work," Carrera continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man unused to opposition. "You're going to search that house, find the child, and turn her over to my custody. In return, I'll overlook your failure to immediately report her whereabouts." Coleman's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse? Then I'll be forced to conclude that you're harboring a kidnapped child. That would be a federal crime, Sheriff. One that would cost you your badge and probably your freedom." Inside the house, Lily whispered against Martha's hand. The bad man came. Martha's eyes met Caleb's across the room, and in that look passed a lifetime of unspoken communication. They both knew Carrera wouldn't stop with taking Lily. A man who'd tracked a child across hundreds of miles wouldn't leave witnesses to his methods. The front door opened slowly, and Caleb stepped onto the porch, his hands visible but his stance defiant. "Sheriff Coleman's got no need to search anywhere. The child you're looking for isn't property to be claimed." Carrera's eyes fixed on Caleb with laser intensity. "Mr. Whitmore, I presume. Helen mentioned you in her letters. Said you had delusions. About paternity. His smile was like a blade. DNA don't lie, but desperate men do. Then let's settle this properly, Caleb said, his voice steady, despite the fear clawing at his chest. Court hearing. Judge decides custody based on law, not threats. The laugh that escaped Carrera's throat was harsh as winter wind. I own judges from here to Mexico City. Farm boy. You think some frontier court is going to choose a dirt-poor rancher over a man of my standing? Behind him, his men spread out slightly, a subtle movement that spoke of practiced violence. Coleman's hand moved closer to his weapon, but 6 against 2 were odds that favored blood over justice. That's when Martha appeared in the doorway, carrying Lily in her arms. The child's blue eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't cry. Instead, she buried her face against Martha's shoulder and whispered one word that changed everything. Papa? Carrera's face went white with rage as he saw the undeniable resemblance between Caleb and the child. Whatever story he'd told himself about Lily's parentage crumbled in the face of genetics that couldn't be argued away. Give me the child, he snarled, his veneer of civility finally stripped away. Give her to me now, or everyone on this porch dies. But Martha stepped forward instead of back, her maternal instincts overriding self-preservation. If you want her, you'll have to kill me first. The standoff crystallized into a moment where violence seemed inevitable, where love and greed would settle their differences with gunpowder and blood. That's when Sheriff Coleman made the choice that would determine whether justice or money ruled the day. Sheriff Coleman drew his weapon in one fluid motion, the barrel aimed squarely at Carrera's chest. Mr. Carrera, you and your men are going to turn around and ride out of my county. Right now. The air crackled with tension as 5 other weapons cleared leather, creating a deadly tableau where the wrong word or sudden movement would paint the farmyard red. But Coleman didn't flinch, his years of experience reading violent men telling him that Carrera was more bully than killer when faced with real opposition. You're making a mistake, Sheriff, Carrera hissed, though his own hand remained carefully away from his gun. I have legal papers, court orders. What you have, Coleman interrupted, is a dead woman's word against a living father's rights. And in my county, blood trumps money every time. Carrera's eyes darted between the unwavering barrel pointed at his heart and the family on the porch. Lily had turned in Martha's arms to look at him directly, her blue eyes reflecting an intelligence too old for her years. When she spoke, her voice carried across the yard with devastating clarity. You're not my papa. He is. She pointed at Caleb with the absolute certainty that only children possess. The words hit Carrera like physical blows. Whatever fantasy he'd constructed about his relationship with Lily shattered against the reality of a child who had never truly been his. His face cycled through rage, disbelief, and finally a cold calculation that made Caleb's blood freeze. This isn't over, Carrera said, his voice deadly quiet. You think this ends here? I have resources you can't imagine, connections that reach farther than your little county line. He gathered his reins with precise movements, his eyes never leaving Lily's face. That child will be mine, one way or another. Mr. Carrera, Coleman said, his gun still trained on the man's chest. If you or any of your men come within 50 miles of this family again, I'll consider it an act of armed aggression, and I respond to armed aggression with permanent solutions. For a long moment, the only sound was wind rustling through grass and the creak of leather as horses shifted beneath their riders. Then Carrera nodded slowly, a gesture that promised future violence rather than acceptance. We'll see, Sheriff. We'll see. The 6 riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the dust they'd emerged from, leaving behind a silence that felt more dangerous than their presence. Caleb knew this wasn't an ending. It was barely even a pause. Men like Carrera didn't accept defeat. They simply changed tactics. But for now, his daughter was safe. Coleman holstered his weapon and turned to face the family on the porch. You folks need to understand something. This man won't give up. He'll find legal ways, illegal ways, whatever it takes to get what he wants. What are you saying? Martha asked, though her arms tightened protectively around Lily. "I'm saying you might need to consider leaving. New territory, new names, new life." Coleman's expression was grim but determined. "I know people up in Colorado Territory. Good folks who ask few questions and give straight answers." Caleb felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Everything he'd built, every connection he'd forged in 20 years of life here, would have to be abandoned. The ranch, the cattle, the community that had become home, all of it sacrificed for a daughter he'd known for less than a day. But when he looked at Lily, still clinging to Martha with absolute trust, the choice became simple. "When do we leave?" he asked. 3 weeks later. A letter arrived at the sheriff's office postmarked from a small town near the Colorado Rockies. Inside, Sheriff Coleman found a photograph of a family standing before a modest cabin. Caleb had grown a beard and looked 10 years younger. Martha held a little girl with bright blue eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. On the back, someone had written, "Lily loves the mountains. She calls them God's playground. Thank you for giving us the chance to start over. The Morrison family." Coleman smiled and filed the letter in his desk drawer, next to a telegram reporting that Vincent Carrera had been arrested for cattle rustling in Mexico and wouldn't be troubling anyone for a very long time. Sometimes justice wore a badge, but more often, it looked like a family willing to sacrifice everything for love. In Colorado Territory, a little girl named Lily Morrison learned to fish in crystal streams, picked wildflowers for her mother's table, and fell asleep each night listening to her father's stories about brave cowboys and the families they protected. She grew up knowing she was loved completely, chosen deliberately, and worth every sacrifice that love required. And if she sometimes dreamed of dusty barns and frightening men, those nightmares faded in the bright mountain sunshine where her real life began. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, where the choices are darker, the stakes higher, and the courage required will leave you breathless. Click on the video now.